So, this question came from quite a few people, and just like a range of questions about feminism. So I feel like, and that's like one of our favorite things to talk about, whether it's on camera, off camera, not on work, at work, whatever you want to say. So, I think that we can confidently say that we did make Sold in America through kind of a feminist focused lens, because we realized how important it was to do that, and that this was a topic that you rarely see like told through that lens. I think that that's true. Yeah. I feel like you rarely see it really told through kind of a feminist focused lens where we're really addressing all of it. So the first question is how we made SIA, or Sold in America, feminist, and made sure there was like representation in talking to people directly affected by the sex trade. So Kate's the producer, so I feel like you should take that one.
Yeah, well, I feel like there's a ton of different ways that we did it. Like, I think that often this is covered kind of through stereotypes. So one really big thing we did, and I think what makes this really feminist, is we were really aware the entire time of kind of the overarching systems that the sex trade exists in. Yeah. So rather than just covering it like, oh, like people are being exploited, or like, oh, this harm is happening, it was kind of a realization that there are big structural problems that kind of all feed into this. And I feel like that's a very like intersectional feminist way to look at it. And also I think there was a lot, I mean, we talked to a lot of LGBT people, a lot of people of color, and I feel like every time that was kind of baked into the conversation is that there's a lot of other intersecting things that have to do with like structural inequalities. Yeah, and we constantly said that we want the voice in this series to be told through the people who are experiencing this the most, and that means from like every angle. So if that's like survivors of trafficking, women who were and are sex workers, and including like the men who are actually buying sex. Like we talked to a wide array, and I think that as we were doing like the back end side of things of like setting up interviews, we were able to see like the numbers and representation in this field, the way that it actually plays out. The majority of the survivors that we talked to were women of color. And whenever we spoke to men who were buying sex, or also the men who are working on, and you guys will like watch this in the series, but the men who are working on handling like the demand side of buying sex, it was a lot of white men. And it was all men, which was really weird. Yeah. Up until that point, we'd pretty much only been interviewing women. We were only talking to women. Yep. Yeah. Unless they were government officials. Yeah. That was a big change. That was like a big realization, I think, for us, was like realizing, oh my gosh, like we're telling this straight from like the voices of the people who are actually being impacted, but the representation is like very apparent when you guys watch the series, and you'll be able to kind of feel that, and I hope you guys are able to feel it the same way that we were able to feel it. But yeah, so I think that I feel like you asked a lot of questions too that were not typically what you would see in conversations on this kind of thing. Yeah. Like while we were at the brothel, we asked questions of people like, do they feel empowered by this? Yeah. And you even asked Dennis Hoff, the brothel owner, if he was like empowering these women, which I feel like the answers were pretty interesting. Like they did feel that they were empowered, but their definition of empowerment was purely based on like money, how much money they're making. Yeah. Yeah. And yeah, they said that it's empowering to feel like you're expensive, which I feel like just even asking that question is a different approach. Yeah. I think that it's fair to say that like even the women who are in this experience, we talk to like a very, like there's obviously a spectrum, and we go through that in the documentary explaining this sex trade spectrum. And I think we talked to people who are all across the spectrum, and you'll be able to feel like the representation through that. Also, this topic, a lot of the times, when I see it in other media, sometimes it's really objectified. Like people sensationalize it a lot because they know it's about sex, and they know that people will want to watch it because of that. And so, especially with our director of photography, Kevin, who is like now a super woke feminist. I mean, he was feminist before, but now I think he's now he's got into a next level situation. Like he talked a lot about visuals and making sure we're not objectifying people.
The legs.
Yeah, so in local news reports on trafficking or on the sex trade, every single report will have like women's legs walking down a street. I'm sure you know what I'm talking about because this happens all the time.
Yeah.
And the other day we were editing and Kevin did this like awesome thing. So the VO, so what Noor was saying is like about the buyers and the Johns and how they're these like anonymous dudes, and Kevin like flipped it. So he had like anonymous man's legs walking down the street and like anonymous men standing.
And that was like a really big deal to us because we were just like, yes!
Yeah, like he was like, I tried a thing, and both of us were like, yes.
We were so happy about it. It was so great.
Cool. So I think the visual, even like
everything is deliberate. So everything in the series that you're watching has been thought about multiple times, whether it's the positioning of the storytelling, every single visual that you see, every single question that I asked, the order that the stories are being told, everything is deliberate. So and we hope you notice that it's deliberate because we want you guys to like leave asking questions and having conversations of how we chose to tell the story.
Yeah. And there's also a lot of other stuff we didn't do. Like it would have been pretty easy to just go to a strip club and like get kind of like sensationalized footage of people working in the sex trade. And
I mean, but like let's be on, like to be honest with you, I feel like majority of the time we were working on this, so like let's be real, people are going to be watching this series. A lot of people are going to watch this series if they're not familiar with the actual issue because it's about sex, and they're going to be like, oh, this is interesting, like let's see what they have to say. But the reality is, like, as we were working on this, I wasn't even thinking about it from that way. Like I feel like I have, and I don't know if you have, like I've become so desensitized to the word sex and like the entire actual like what sex is and how this actually plays a role, because everything that we're talking about relating to sex, I feel like for us has come back to money, power, injustice, inequality, and that's really what this has been about for us. And that's, I think that what you, like, I think that's why this series is gonna mess with people's minds, but I think that like the feminist focused lens stems from really taking out the objectification in the storytelling equation that people so often use when talking about this, and really focuses on the human aspect, the injustices, and like I feel like just not just shedding a light, but like exposing this dirty secret that like our society has and how we treat people involved.
Yeah, and I feel like there's a big movement within other gender-based violence stuff, so whether that's domestic violence or, you know, campus rape, any of the big conversations that we're having right now, where it's really important to talk to the people who have been affected by it and like listen to their stories and believe them. And I feel like we came at this subject with the same approach. It was like, let's talk to the people who are actually in this, who have actually experienced the harm that they're telling us about.
Yep.
And whether that is people who are trafficked or people who are sex workers, but they're more on that survival sex end, where it's like they really didn't feel like they had any other choices, and just kind of like listening to their stories and believing them.
I think so. I think that we did a really good job. I think that this entire thing was very relatable, and that a lot of the experiences you're going to be watching are pretty extreme, and not, I wouldn't say it's normal, but unfortunately I think a lot of it is common. And I think that we'll be able to kind of rewire our way of thought towards this entire thing through kind of this feminist focused lens, if that makes sense. How do you define feminism though?
So I define feminism, I have this like almost memorized now, I guess. I think that it's advocating for the social, political, and economic equality of the genders. And I think that there are, a lot of that is focused toward women of multiple gender identities, but there's also a role of patriarchy hurting men, which is something we kind of go into.
Well, that's actually part of what somebody was asking, was like, how does the patriarchy actually negatively affect men?
Yeah. I feel like one of our sources like said it really well. He was talking about gender-based violence because he works with the buyers, trying to like show them why they shouldn't be purchasing sex. And he was talking about how he grew up in a domestic violence household, and he said that he realized that what was happening with his dad abusing the people in his family was that his dad had his own kind of social and emotional shortcomings, where something bad would happen in his life and then he felt privileged to take it out on the people around him.
Yeah.
And I feel like those two things, like lack of social emotional learning and then privilege, are like what leaves men unable to cope with things sometimes, and then that ends up translating into violence.
Yep, and that's like something that's so heavily rooted in our culture as it is now. And so the source that she's talking about also talks about like dismantling patriarchy and curing toxic masculinity, which was something that like new for me to learn. And I thought like I think it's fair to say like I thought that I knew everything about this, and I realized I know nothing about this. So learning about toxic masculinity and how the patriarchy negatively affects men is something that was very eye-opening. And also because like we decided, and especially Kate decided to like kind of go after telling the story through, again, like this feminist focus lens. And then finally, for if we are talking about like a feminist focus lens, I think it's important that we acknowledge the change in feminism today. So a lot of times people ask about like white feminism in America and how that's changing today. I think we did a very deliberate job of making sure that the feminist focus lens that this story is being told through is intersectional feminism, but we've had several conversations about the evolution of like white feminism into what it is today.
Yeah, because I feel like I definitely grew up in the very like white feminist. Like feminist was always a word that I felt applied to me, which is because I'm an upper middle class white woman in America. So like my grandma and my mom were fine with that. But then it's like, okay, how do we include everyone in this conversation? Like, and I know a lot of people don't even identify with the word feminist because it has that like racial history. So
that's like a really huge deal. And I think that in Sold in America, we do a good job of being able to show like the raw reality of the struggle that women go through today based on Kate's definition of feminism, and like understanding that there are socioeconomic, political inequalities that lead people, especially women of color, to really desperate situations.
Yeah, and I don't know if we like should include this, but one thing that was really interesting I thought that we learned about was how even the history of the conversation around trafficking is pretty racial.
Oh my gosh.
So,
no, yeah, you should totally, I think we should.
Yeah, so we saw some of the like original documents that talked about trafficking from like the late 1800s, 1900s, and back then it was basically framed as an issue of white slavery. And
so, which is so crazy.
Yeah, so basically at the time it was super racialized. Like if you were a person of color and you were caught up in the sex trade, you were seen as a prostitute and arrested. And then if you were a white woman, it was seen as trafficking. And I feel like the kind of history of that and how we think of this issue is really interesting. And like our first episode will go into that, kind of about how like our society continues to see some people as worthy victims and some as not. And oftentimes the difference is class or race.
Yeah.
Or gender identity, sexuality, I mean, kind of all of these things. So,
and when she says like white slavery, like there were actually books titled like white slavery, talking about like human trafficking, because if a black woman was being trafficked,
and not even a woman, like we saw primary sources of like 16-year-olds that were black,
like children, they would still get arrested as like prostitutes. But if it was a white girl or woman, it would be considered trafficking, which was crazy.
And we didn't even learn about that until pretty late in the reporting.
Yeah, and not only that, but I feel like it wasn't something that we ever saw anywhere else.
Yeah, I still haven't. I would love to do more reporting on that, because I think I don't fully understand it, but what we saw was like, oh, yikes.
Yeah, we were talking about that for a while. But yeah, anyway.
Oh wait, you didn't, what is your definition of feminism?
Oh. So feminism is kind of this movement or this cultural phenomenon of equality in a social, economic, educational aspect for people of all genders, but also, and I forgot how we like had this conversation, like it's equal but not the same.
Yeah, like we don't we're not advocating for like the abolishment of gender or anything like that.
Yeah, I think it's acknowledging respectively like objective differences among genders and making sure that there's equality spread throughout.
And inequality, like we have big things we need to work on. I know like a lot of your followers are international, but just like looking at the US, which we're feminists in that lens, like our representation in Congress, it's like 20% women. It's not even close to half. So, which means it's 80% dudes
who are making decisions.
Yeah.
Like regarding half of the population.
For all of us. So it's just like kind of big things like that I would love to see more equality, more representation.
And just like, I feel like for me, a bigger cultural shift. And I think that this year has been very apparent about like the cultural shift that's happening. But really acknowledging like the flaws in our culture towards women and towards, I guess, people who are not white guys, if that makes sense. Yeah. Like cisgendered males. Yeah, cisgendered males. And cisgender. I always do that, guys. I'm sorry. I always do that. People, I'm sorry. I'm terrible at this. Cisgender males. But yeah, like acknowledging like the injustices that happen and not being afraid to have the conversation on how to tackle it. And that means getting people uncomfortable, and that's really what we have been trying to do for the past year. And I think that when this series comes out, you guys will see that we've really tried to do. And we hope that you guys get uncomfortable but aren't afraid to ask questions and have those conversations. But yeah.
And it's a learning process always.
Yeah, it's definitely a learning process, and I think that like part of why we want to do this behind the scenes thing is because we are still going through the learning process. So we're putting forward like our best work with everything. Like we've put everything into this, but we also want to tell you guys that like we're still learning about this, and we realize that like this is probably one of the most in-depth reports that you'll see on like the full sex trade, but there's still so much to be talked about and so much to be done, and there are so many experiences that like just people need to kind of understand.
Yeah.
So we hope that you guys go into this with an open mind. Cut.
Hey friends, thank you so much for watching the video. I hope you enjoyed it. Please don't forget to give it a thumbs up, comment, and of course subscribe. And don't forget to hit me up on Snapchat, Twitter, Facebook, Instagram. See you guys on the next one.